Uh, Ms. Thunberg, thank you for your involvement here today. I commend you. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. Is there what particular study or scientific report did you read that made you come to this conclusion?
Thank you for your question. First of all, let me just clear that those are metaphors. In speeches, you often use metaphors. Of course, I don't mean literally that I want people to panic. So there was no scientific study that made me come to that conclusion.
This video is about how the IPCC are deceiving you about the science. There is simply no correct backup evidence for a climate emergency. We'll begin by showing you some scientific research that may surprise you. US heat waves are now no more common than in 1900, and the warmest temperatures have not risen in the past 50 years. Well, given all the things that you read in the newspapers, all the things that you see on television, all the things that governments are doing with net zero, this is certainly going against the narrative. And of course it is. But it is not my statement. It's from the US Climate Science Special Report 2017, known as the CSSR reports. So you may well ask, well, how authoritative is this report? Who commissioned it? Well, it's actually the US government. This report is an authoritative assessment of the science of climate change with a focus on the United States. It represents the first of 2 volumes of the 4th National Climate Assessment mandated by the Global Change Research Act of 1990. This is just one example of the clashes between the research and what's being postulated in COP26. I will give the references for everything else in this video, but will not follow up in detail like I have with this one. All my climate change videos include the evidence to back up what I am claiming. Evidence that is freely available if you search for it. Greenland's ice sheet isn't sinking any more rapidly today than it was 80 years ago, when human influences were less than 20% of today's. Again, peer-reviewed and published in Nature magazine in 2020. Global wildfire area has declined more than 25% since 2003. 2020 was amongst the least active years in wildfire record. Again, a peer-reviewed paper published as late as 2021. Hurricanes. Well, no detectable human impact on hurricanes over the past century. And who wrote that? Well, the CSSR reports again, the USA government, and did it in 2019. Of course, there is overwhelming evidence of that fact. Now turning to economics. The net economic impact of 6 degrees centigrade warming, if it happened, would be minimal. And of course that forecast is way past any of the model forecasts. That's much more extreme. And who published that? Well, that was published by the IPCC themselves in 2018. So looking at the wider economic impact, look at this statement. For most economic sectors, the impact of climate change will be small relative to the impacts of other drivers, such as changes in population, age, income, technology, relative prices, lifestyle regulations, governance, and many other aspects of socio-economic development will have an impact on supply and demand of economic goods and services that is large relative to the impact of climate change. And the source of that? The IPCC themselves. I cannot blame anybody for being confused when they see all this sort of controversy, from governments lying, Are the IPCC lying? Is Greta lying? Well, we can dismiss Greta because there's simply no science there at all. Or can you trust governments when governments really do get it wrong? Back in 1999, I was campaigning against the madness of the millennium bug. Everyone got it wrong then. The government certainly cannot be trusted. So who to trust? That leaves us with scientists. And what really matters in science is that the theory is proven against the observations. Without the theory being proven against the experiment, the actual real-life thing, it is meaningless. Well, the alarmist scientists cannot be trusted because every single prediction they have made, from the coming ice age in the 70s onto polar bears dying out when in actual fact they're at record population numbers, to the Arctic melting when it hasn't, all have been wrong. It's like someone standing outside with a placard saying the end of the world is nigh and continuing to do it every week. Why would you believe them? You can't. You have to only trust the science where it is verified by real-life experiment and proven to be right. Because no matter what the theory, no matter how beautiful it is, unless it's proven to be right with real-world data, it is meaningless. So let's now look at the steps in the process of issuing those alarmist reports from the IPCC. Just who does it? What are the steps that are taken by the IPCC to produce all this alarm? Starting with the name again, the IPCC is not a scientific body. It is controlled by politicians. Politicians can and do override the science. Most importantly, they do write the summary for policymakers, which is what guides governments around the world. So let us look at this process step by step. Each scientist, committee member, must conform to its own government's rules and policies. They're appointed to uphold these policies from 195 countries throughout the world. But government policies are not science, they're politics. But the panel isn't just government representative, it includes many non-scientists, UN officials and the government representatives. The panel is responsible for writing the Summary for Policymakers report, and it's that document that informs governments around the world. The IPCC panel overrides the science by editing in and out its own wishes into that report, and all the members have to agree sentence by sentence, and hence the report to the world is a political report, not a scientific one. For example, in COP26, the summary report warns of increasing hurricane frequency, whilst the report within the 4,000 scientific papers actually forecasts 25% lower hurricane frequency. The result is that many scientists have protested against the report and the misrepresentation of their work, and as a result have left. These protests frequently mark the end of their careers. Without climate alarmism continuing, there are no career paths in what is a huge alarmism industry. It is about a transfer of wealth from Western nations to the underdeveloped world, and most votes are with that underdeveloped world. And of course, we know that turkeys do not vote for Christmas. What may be appropriate at this time is an old Russian saying. It goes like this: all you need is a trough, and there will be pigs. Many well-meaning people have been brainwashed into believing that there really is a climate emergency. Credulous children have been one of the saddest victims of this poisonous propaganda. But as Mark Twain rightly said, it's easier to fool people than to persuade them that they're being fooled. And a prime example of being fooled, you have to look no further than our Prime Minister.
Hi Beth, hello, good afternoon everybody. We've just been having a very, very important and powerful session about climate change, a round table. Heard from some of the countries really staring down the barrel, the Maldives, Bangladesh, the Marshall Islands.
NASA and others have measured these islands using satellites, and they have actually grown. For example, scientists at the University of Auckland found that atolls in the Pacific nations of Marshall Islands and Kiribati, as well as the Maldives archipelago in the Indian Ocean, have grown up to 8% in size over the last 6 decades, despite sea level rise. So you're trying to compensate these people for nothing, Boris. But I think we should let him continue to dig his hole.
Countries pleading with the developed world to step up to the plate and supply the finance needed to make the changes necessary to fight climate change in the developing world.
India demanding over $1 trillion, Africa demanding over that every year. All it's about is the transfer of money from Western countries to the undeveloped world. That is what it's about. The fact is that all the claims that Boris is making there have been proven without doubt by satellite measurement to be incorrect. The islands are growing. The Maldives are bigger. The Pacific Islands are bigger.
1 minute to midnight moment, and the clock is ticking. We have to get everybody to do more.
And with Boris telling us that the world is in such a desperate state, 1 minute to midnight, etc., what does he do? He takes a private jet from Glasgow back to London just to attend for one night a dinner at a men's club. That is some sort of serious hypocrisy. In fact, the hypocrisy of the whole COP26 is just unbelievable. But now let's take a look at some real science. All the predictive models by the IPCC to date have turned out to be wrong. This red line is the average of the models. It is not the most extreme of them, which alarmists tend to mention a lot, just the average of them. Now just look at that red line compared to the reality. Reality is measured by both balloons and satellites, the actual measurements, and they're the things that matter. The difference is enormous. This red curve is what the world governments are basing their plans on, and in particular Boris leading the pack. And on this totally false basis, which just ignores observation and reality, you are expected to change your lives. Last year, the work of these two professors has resulted in building a model that when checked against reality actually works. I know that these charts may look complicated, but bear with me, it is really very simple. In the left-hand column, you have the theory in different parts of the world. You have it in the Sahara region, you have it in the Mediterranean region, and in the Antarctic region. So those are the theoretical curves. And on the right, you have the actual measured curves measured by satellite. But what are we measuring? Well, we're measuring the amount of heat, if you like, that leaves the Earth. But like all good science, you have to measure that theory on the left against the practical observed on the right. And this agreement couldn't be better. So at last, we have a model that can actually predict the effect of CO2 and methane, etc., on the climate and measure what changes are made. For example, if we double CO2, what happens? Now there is a red dotted curve on the graphs there. And this curve is as if there were no greenhouse gases at all, just Earth radiating out to space its heat. And the difference between that curve, the red dotted curve, and the black curve is the amount of retained heat, the amount of global warming, if you like. Now, while we're looking at these graphs, let's take a quick look at Antarctica, because there's something unusual there. In this case, more heat is radiated to space with greenhouse gases than without greenhouse gases. So CO2 actually helps cool Antarctica, not heat it up. So just look at the incredible agreement between the two curves, the theoretical and the measured. This agreement gives us a lot of confidence in the validity of the model, and that is very different to what you have with the IPCC models. Very different. And this model allows us to experiment and judge what the differences are when we double CO2, etc. William Happer, its author, is probably the #1 expert in the world on the CO2 molecule. So to recap and drive the point home, because the agreement is so good between the calculations and the measurements, we at last have a numerical method that is trustworthy, and that is the correct use of the scientific method. Therefore, we can conduct numerical experiments with CO2 doubled, etc. So let's just do that. Let's see what the effect is of doubling CO2 from its present 400 parts per million level to 800. Now, taking a look at this close-up, what we have here is the part that CO2 contributes. It's below that green line there. In that area here is the CO2 contribution, and it's a significant greenhouse gas, no doubt about that, but it has its limits. And the question now is, what happens when you double the amount of CO2? Well, the black line is the current level of CO2, and the little red line, as we're showing here, is the new level after doubling. Hardly any difference at all. Because of extra CO2, according to NASA, in a 30-year period, 14% extra vegetation was added to Earth. That's equivalent to 2 USA land masses added to Earth. And of that 14%, 70% was due to CO2. So in other words, about 10% extra vegetation on Earth, totally due to CO2 in a 30-year period. But then we have record cereal crops, record rice crops, a lot more. Because since this study, lots more vegetation has been growing on Earth in places it never grew before. So let's take the Sahara Desert. This study showed that Sahara is shrinking, becoming greener. And how much by how much? Well, it shrunk by 8% over the last 30 years. This is profound because the Sahara covers a vast area of 9.2 million square kilometres. 8% means more than 700,000 square kilometres are green, an area almost as big as Germany and France. But you don't hear about this, do you? You don't hear about these studies because it doesn't promote the alarmist agenda. Frankly, instead of Africa demanding trillions from us, they should be thanking us for giving them all this extra land. It's like handing them France and Germany together in a simple 30-year period. But then you don't hear about the record harvests that they're having in Africa, because again, the alarmists don't want you to. So the takeaway from this model is, if CO2 was zero, it would make a huge difference to the Earth. In fact, the Earth would be about 25% cooler. We need it. It's important, besides being plant food and us not being able to survive as humans without it. If CO2 were doubled, it'd make a very small difference. Methane and nitrous oxide are extremely hard to find in any graph. They do not contribute to the greenhouse effect. That means that car exhausts do not contribute to the greenhouse effect. Yes, they pollute the air and need action, but they should not be considered as a greenhouse gas. And molecules of other tiny concentration have no effect. Plotting the CO2 against time with all the different climate conferences on them, you can clearly see here that climate conferences make no difference whatsoever to the rise of CO2. Every one of them, no effect. And that includes Paris, of course. Now, COP26 in Glasgow is going to be no different. CO2 is going to rise because the Far East, China and India and so on, they are outputting so much CO2 now. And regardless of how we cut CO2 or claim to have cut it, because all we do in effect is export the industry to China instead of having the jobs here, for them not only to produce more CO2, but also pollute more than we would do if it was produced here. In any effect, climate agreements are meaningless. COP26 is meaningless. The politicians will try to put a spin on this, but it won't change anything. So we have a good future. We have a future where CO2 is going to carry on increasing. It's not going to warm the planet, but what it is going to do is give the planet a huge amount of extra plant growth, and that's to be welcomed by all.
Thank you for your question. First of all, let me just clear that those are metaphors. In speeches, you often use metaphors. Of course, I don't mean literally that I want people to panic. So So there was no scientific study that that made me come to that conclusion.
So there we are. We live in a world where a young girl without any scientific backup is making claims that people listen to, and she is welcomed to appear on the BBC Newsnight for 20-minute interviews, appear with world leaders, address the UN, without any basis at all for doing so. What sort of world are we living in?